Welcome back. Thanks for coming back. This is Ireland Said Yes.
For the people who don't know me at all, my name is Shane. I'm a comedian from Dublin City, Ireland. And this show is called But He's Gay. Right? Yeah, and I co-wrote this show over the last 2 years with my lovely wife, Yvonne. Where are you, darling? She's here. No, of course, full gay. Full gay.
Okay, thank you.
And if you see me looking at the screen or checking things,
Okay,
I'm not
now I'm
bored,
gonna
I'm
look
just
at.
checking
No,
it.
I'm gonna look at
Yeah.
Shane. He's a good-looking one.
Thank you.
You both are.
Wow.
You both are.
You're now listening to episode 2. I'm still Shane Daniel Byrne. If you're new here, then I'm sorry, but I think you should leave and go back and listen to episode 1. I hate to turn you away so early on, but there's good stuff in there. I don't want you to miss out. Today is jam-packed. It's full of detail, drama, intrigue and subterfuge. It's a bit like one of those films in the 90s where a plucky young investigative journalist makes an unlikely alliance with a rookie cop who also happens to be a struggling single mother, and they band together to crack the case and see that truth and justice prevail, even if this thing goes all the way to the White House, goddammit. Now, I don't have a co-host, so I'm going to have to be the cop and the journalist at the same time, so bear with me. When we left episode 1, we were hearing about a resurgence of interest in activism among the LGBTQ in Ireland. By the way, you might notice that different speakers use different terms when talking about LGBTQ issues. Some say queer, some might say the gay community, some will say LGBT or LGBTQ, and there are those who say LGBTQIA+. These are all valid, these are all fine. And anyway, don't worry, because we have bigger, gayer fish to fry.
Big change to the law in the Republic of Ireland.
This is the moment same-sex supporters in Ireland knew they'd made history.
The historic referendum in Ireland over the weekend.
A controversial subject in the mainly Roman Catholic country.
They will be the first country to legalise same-sex marriage in this way. It's never happened before.
I think Ireland is this beacon of incredible hope that with the right messaging and the right leadership, you can actually change how you treat the people in your country in a lifetime.
We were campaigning because Ireland was changing. People were ready to think about a different kind of Ireland.
Yes to inclusion, yes to generosity, yes to love, yes to equal marriage.
Ireland Said Yes is an Onic original podcast. Do you remember that woman with the American accent you heard at the start of this episode? The one who was correctly calling me good looking. That was Katherine Zappone. In 2006, I was doing everything I possibly could to avoid studying for my Leaving Certificate exams at the end of school. Katherine and her wife Louise Gilligan were far busier than me. They were starting a game of political chicken with the Irish state. They were married in Canada back in September 2003. They had a same-sex marriage, and they wanted the Irish state to recognise that. Katherine and Anne-Louise met very much by chance. They had both enrolled in a doctoral programme in Boston College, Katherine living in New York, Anne-Louise in Ireland. They were the only two students enrolled on the programme.
And I remember, asking some of the people, well, where is this other person? Because I was quite nervous about it. There was only one other in the program. And eventually we had a gathering for what they call an orientation. And in she walked. And, she really was gorgeous and it looked very Irish. And I'd never really met an Irish woman before, beautiful green eyes. And as soon as she opened her mouth, just she had a fantastic accent. And so we, found out that it was the two of us. And honestly, like within a week or so, that, I had fallen in love with her, although I, didn't think it could all be reciprocated because she's from Ireland. It was 1981. But after a couple of weeks, I shared with her about my own identity and and then she said to me, that wonderful sentence she said to me is, I don't believe in labels, I just believe in love. And
And you were married, flashing forward, you were married in Canada. And was that normal at the time in Canada? Where in 2003
it was not. It was not. We wanted to get our life partnership recognized in law. In July of 2003, British Columbia of Canada, one of the provinces, actually decided that they would open their gates to lesbian and gay people, even if they were not a resident or a citizen. Everywhere else in the world, if you wanted to get married or civilly partnered, and we explored going to Denmark or Germany or Sweden or whatever, you had to be either a citizen or a resident. So they said, come. And we found that out in July. And in September of 2003, we were there. And we got married, and that's why it was Vancouver.
And was it a civil marriage or was it a civil partnership, civil union?
No, it was a marriage.
Not long afterwards, they settled in Ireland, and like anyone else, they wanted to get their domestic affairs in order.
We came back, we wrote to the revenue commissioners, and we said, dear revenue commissioners, would you just please change our marital status? We got married in Canada, just like anybody else in Canada is paying. And they said no.
Nevertheless, they persisted. They took on a case which became known by their initials, KAL. Cal.
The Cal case gave it an injection of realism. They took a case, from an interesting angle. It was through revenue. It was a case against revenue. So it was kind of had this tax lens on it. At the time, trying to get these rights through the courts was a tactic that was being used in the US.
And the revenue commissioner said, no, sorry ladies, we don't do that in Ireland. You have to be a man and a woman.
The revenue commissioners refused to recognise their Canadian marriage, citing the Irish definition of marriage as between a man and a woman. This refusal prompted Zappone and Gilligan to initiate legal proceedings in 2004, arguing that the non-recognition of their marriage violated constitutional rights to equality, marriage and a family. Big, meaty, heavy, important stuff. Eventually, our intrepid duo were granted leave to bring a case to the High Court. Their barrister's argument was that neither the Constitution or Irish laws specifically stated that marriage was between a man and a woman. Did you feel like we're starting a war of attrition here? We're going to start chipping away at stuff here. I'm thinking back to David Norris's case of many years before.
Yeah,
did you feel like, okay, well, there's that. Look, they got that over the line. We can get something here.
Yes. Well, I always believed we would win. And initially it was the court case. And in fact, I didn't think it should take that much time. And I remember leaving our lawyer the first day, and we said to her, well, how much time would this take? And she just kind of laughed. And she said, Catherine, we don't know. And furthermore, it could cost a lot of money as well. So that's why the support of the lawyers were so important. But what we did realize, though, is I thought we could win in court. I thought I'd have to go to the Supreme Court. But at the same time, we really believed that we would need to build a public awareness and consciousness to support and create an environment where the courts, would feel comfortable in saying, okay, now I know they're not supposed to be influenced by what's going on within society, but what goes on in society is really important. When we decided to go take the case, we had our legal team. We also thought we need to gather a group of people to help us support the building of public awareness and consciousness. And that's where the Cal case, the Cal group came from. Grania Healy was the first one to help us out and take the leadership of that.
Before Grania went on to become co-director of the Campaign for Marriage Equality, she was also just a pal helping out a pal.
So they brought a number of us together, friends who'd been involved in campaigns over the years, and said, look, we're going to take this case and we need some support. So that's really what kicked off marriage equality. A number of us got together, myself, Janice Charlton, Alva Smith, Linda Cullen, Fergan Ivrin, Orla Howard, a group of us who would have known each other from feminist campaigns and activism. I'd been chair of the National Women's Council, so I had a lot of kind of contacts around the country and connections.
Talk about women supporting women, huh? I love it. This informal group became the start of the formal campaign for marriage equality, scheming in the background years and years before all the gays and their allies were knocking on doors, canvassing for a yes in 2015. We're listening to Sonia Tiernan. Sonia is a historian of modern Ireland and literally wrote a book on the history of marriage equality in Ireland.
I suppose their idea in the background, after reading their kind of accounts as well of their reasons behind it, that they had hoped that this was going to become a movement, that other couples would come forward and also do the same thing so that they could put some kind of pressure on.
I think that when this was in the news back then, I would have hidden away from it and ignored all of this noise, pretending that this has nothing to do with me. Every generation criticises the one that comes next because sometimes LGBT plus people can be forgetful of their history, the trailblazers from the past, forgotten about. I'm guilty of it. Katherine and Louise were even on the Late Late Show in 2006, fighting for their cause.
Well, I think Katherine would have clearly known her sexual identity, and I would say in meeting Katherine, I was surprised by love.
You were surprised, ambushed?
Well, I was really so overcome that I suddenly had met somebody that I could know without hesitation that I could spend the rest of my life with them.
And this is a long time ago. But that's how it worked, and look at you now.
Oh, you see? It all worked
out. How early did you kind of vow to stay with each other? I mean, there was no civil marriage at that time available to two men or two women. So when did you formalize your relationship?
Well, I suppose it took just about a couple of months, really, after getting to know one another, that we decided that we would like to spend the rest of our lives with each other. But we also realized, or at least for myself anyhow, that that was a very, very big decision. And I had never made that decision before. And so I wanted some time to make sure that was really the right thing to do. So it wasn't until I think about 8 or 9 months later that we planned a very, very special ceremony, invited some close friends, and effectively vowed ourselves to each other as life partners.
The little gay babies born that year are old enough to vote now, 9 years old when the referendum happened, and it makes me wonder about all the others who made strides that maybe I've never heard of. I'm sorry, I'm getting wistful. Another white cis gay man hogging the limelight. Back to work.
What was great about having the two of them do it was the type of people that they were. They weren't threatening in any way. They were these educated women who could answer the questions, who could get their point across, and they came across very well from a media perspective. So that gave much bigger visibility into this idea, into the public in Ireland, as to, well, actually, what's the problem? What's the harm in giving these women recognition? They've been married abroad, so legally they're married in another country. So why not extend it?
The Cal case landed the argument for marriage equality in the public consciousness. For the queer community in Ireland and beyond, visibility remains important and representation matters. This idea of dragging a serious issue into the public consciousness means that it could hopefully make way for acceptance and eventually meaningful change. And there's a precedent here, actually. Our community has experienced this before, back in the horrors of the 1980s. David Carroll, former executive director of LGBT charity Belong To, explained.
Yes, HIV and AIDS was awful. It came at a really bad time. The community was kind of, under fire anyway, and then there was another kind of, as well as people, unfortunately dying, it was also used as a stick to beat up the community and further prejudice. I just remember being terrified, there was no information. Like, I was a kid out in Finglas, they weren't reaching me. But also what HIV and AIDS did, and I think it's sometimes forgotten, is it brought the gay community to the attention of statutory government providers who realised we need to do something here in response. So in a way, a lot of the first jobs in the gay community were centred around HIV prevention, because it was funders kind of saying, we don't know how to do this.
The AIDS crisis also shone a light on queer people being able to look after their partners with dignity and respect, and wanting to look after their partners with dignity and respect. Sadly, they weren't always allowed to do this. The sheer devastation, loss, and horror of the AIDS crisis spans into all sorts of areas of our society. And among these painful threads are the countless stories of the victims of AIDS being denied their rights on their deathbeds, and then their grieving partners being left out in the cold. unable to have their relationship recognised by the state.
There had been these dreadful cases of couples, for example, who would go to a hospital where one was very ill and her or his partner would not be recognised by the hospital as the next of kin or the person to be contacted, and would recognise only the birth family.
The system saw them as a stranger to the partner they loved. Their relationships were not equal. No equality. Katherine Zappone remembers the AIDS crisis of the 80s as a time of community, despite all the tragic loss.
Wasn't it extraordinary to watch the men taking care of each other during the AIDS crisis, and how, it was, as a lesbian, just taking that in, and it was terrible, in terms of what happened, but at the same time to be a witness to that and how that provided some elements of healing in that scourge.
Now, we're not here to debate the response to the AIDS crisis in full, that's another story, but it is part of this one too. This does serve as an example of how a queer community and their allies worked together and demanded action, and how this made the state take notice, albeit eventually, albeit too late for so many and not enough for most. In December 2006, Miss Justice Elizabeth Dunn delivered her judgment on Katherine and Anne Louise's attempt to have their Canadian marriage recognised in Ireland.
This has always been about our fundamental right to marry just like any other couple, so said Katherine Zappone and Anne Louise Gilligan after today's High Court judgment. They had argued that by refusing to recognise their marriage, the state was in breach of their rights under the Irish Constitution and the European Convention on Human Rights. But today, Ms Justice Elizabeth Dunn said she could not accept the couple's argument that marriage within the Constitution includes same-sex marriage. She said that the definition of marriage had always been understood as opposite-sex marriage, and that though the Constitution is a living instrument, there was no evidence of a changing consensus on this issue. And she said this position was not incompatible with the European Convention on Human Rights.
When the judgment came in from Elizabeth Dunn, one of the things she said is she would not accept the arguments because she said society, is not really there. And she was right.
We all knew that they weren't going to win, but sometimes you just need to start these campaigns to really push it forward and get it into, people were speaking about it. There was a lot of people speaking about it because it was going through all the different courts. Then they'd be back on the news again. It brought the whole topic into the public imagination. And that's really what the important thing about it was, that they needed to do that. And it also mobilised the LGBT community, definitely did.
Like Katherine Zappone, David Carroll took advantage of more progressive legislation elsewhere, abroad, while everyone back home in Ireland was pondering the next steps.
You're a married man.
I am.
Were you a civil partnered man?
Nope. We were lucky that we could afford to. We went to Canada and got married in 2009 because we were sick of waiting. And while I was in Toronto, we were staying in the gay village. I happened to see weddings and stuff like that. And it was just really kind of took me. I remember kind of really thinking, wow. Made friends there. The following year went back on holidays with my other half, Gary. And he was kind of the same. And we kind of started this conversation about, we should do something, should we? And it was so unromantic. It was basically, I remember the conversation was, will we wait until the civil partnership thing comes in here? Will we get married in Canada? Or will we just have a party? And we actually had a friend come over to us one night with a bottle of wine and a flip chart, and we workshopped it. Like the most unromantic.
When David got home to Ireland, his fancy new Canadian marriage from across the water was the talk of the town.
You used your marriage as a way to show people this can happen. This is something that we can achieve. How did you feel about doing that?
Again, it was a new thing because I remember being in Tesco's in Finglas, and I had just paid for my shopping, and I was walking out, and the Northside News was there, and I was the headline on the Northside News. And again, not because it was, I demand the right to get married, says David Carroll, and blah, blah, blah. To see it in Finglas and the Tesco's was just, it was jarring. I meet my neighbours and they'd start asking me about gay issues. That didn't happen before. Do you know what I mean? Like, you were talking about being gay a lot.
I mean, we're all talking for sure, but when are we not?
But when you're a young gay, right, and you're coming out to your straight friends, because you still have mostly straight people in your community at that time, whatever. And I like coming out. I don't mind if people want to move on from it or whatever, and they say it's oppressive. I like it. It's another rite of passage. It's a nice. You tell the world who you are in the most honest, uncertain terms, whatever. It's nice. I like it. I support it. And now, like when you're gay, you have to come out all the time in little ways, right? So if you get a new GP, you have to tell him. You know what I mean? He's like, turn around, whatever. You get a hotel and you're like, yeah, they're both boys' names, but one bed. Thank you very much.
A few years after the Cal case, there was still fierce debate among activists in the queer community on what to do next. Convincing wary Irish politicians to change the law on marriage equality would take time and no doubt long, hard, arduous work lobbying behind the scenes. Sluggish. A constitutional referendum was even mooted.
I had it up to here with referendums.
Elva Smith again now.
We'd had such a bad time around abortion in 2007, where it was a very low turnout. And, I felt, oh God, do we have to go down the route of a referendum? But of course, there were many steps along the way in having those discussions, not least of which was the decision on behalf of Glen, the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network, to go for a civil partnership first, so to speak, as a major path on the road to marriage. And that, I felt, I could understand why they were doing that, but I did feel it was not really the best way to go about things.
Not long after, Glen, the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network, felt that incremental change in the form of civil partnership would be the better approach. Instead of pushing for a referendum on marriage equality, this would be the next best step.
Brian Sheehan, I was the executive director of Glen for about 10 years, which was advocacy on policy and law and everything else. A government has to propose a bill, it has to pass through the Parliament, and then there's a referendum. And nobody anywhere thought a referendum could be won. For anyone who doesn't quite know or remember the referendums in Ireland, referendums are dire in Ireland, right? The best example is divorce. 1986, divorce referendum, all the polls are saying yes. Hello, divorce, goodbye, daddy. The referendum was lost, right? It took 10 years for the second referendum in 96 on divorce. And that won by 10,000 votes because the weather was dire and people didn't turn up to vote, right? So referendums are terrible. You should never have a referendum. And how do you build political will to recognise and support lesbian and gay couples and their children? And secondly, that civil partnership with all of the rights or almost all the rights and responsibilities of marriage would provide urgently needed protection for lesbian gay couples.
So while Glen and their supportive TDs lobbied the government for civil partnership, there was still plenty who had reservations about it.
Well, civil partnership was part of a global trend, I suppose, of not giving same-sex couples full marriage rights, but giving them a legislative standing for relationship recognition, from which various rights would flow around inheritance, tax, property, that kind of stuff. And so this kind of idea of relationship recognition for same-sex couples was very new. And there was 2 points of view within the community in Ireland. Civil partnership, yes, let's go for that as a stepping stone. And then after that, we might be able to get marriage rights. Or there was, no, we need to actually go for marriage rights from the jump. And so there was this kind of ideological and rights-based debate within the community of why should we be on a different footing.
Una mentioned the divisive context there. I've been calling it the gay civil war. I should also mention that literally nobody else calls it that or thinks of it that way, but I do enjoy the drama.
And one of the main issues around it, apart from the fact that it was a different set of rights and it wasn't full equality, was how it did not provide for rights around children. And obviously loads of same-sex couples have kids, and there was also a perception that more lesbian couples or queer women, queer female couples had children, and that the kind of rights being pursued under civil partnership were more around money. And so there was this kind of gendered split, I think, as well within the community. And it was very fractured, it really was.
A significant step was taken today towards making civil unions legal for gay couples. New legislation has been published, but campaigners say that it doesn't go far enough.
We had done some research that was showing us that there were actual differences between being in a civil partnership and being married, legal differences. Some of them seemed small. For example, you can open a grave to be buried with your dead husband or wife. Civil partnership didn't allow you to do that. Now, I know that seems small, but if you're that person, that's huge.
Some people were saying it's marriage or nothing. Or do you want something that provides almost all the rights and obligations of marriage? And should a referendum be held at some point in the future, we can finish the job.
And what are the protections they got? Is it to do with, like, is it finances? Is it inheritance?
Civil partnership is identical to marriage, except for 2 or 3 things, right? One is because they assume there'll be court cases challenging it, and there were, and the government won them. But everything else, tax, finance, inheritance, housing, domestic violence protections, everything else, apart from the odd one they forgot and patched up later, everything else was the same. So anywhere you saw marriage in legislation, it had marriage or civil partnership. So lesbian and gay couples were protected on the same basis as marriage.
The Gay and Lesbian Equality Network, Glen, were ploughing ahead. They'd been building relationships with political parties. They had men on the inside.
The Green Party was today marking the launch of the Civil Partnership Bill, which sets out a legally recognised union for gay and lesbian couples. The legislation could come into effect before the end of the year. Stephen Murphy, TV3 News.
But when civil partnership came in first, I mean, was there drama around this? Because the public on the outside, it's like, oh, that's a good step forward. But then other people were also fuming at this and didn't want the civil partnership at all. And you were in Glen, and Glen was kind of pushing this as towards, were you guys going, let's get this going and then we can keep moving towards something else? What was your position then when that was coming in?
So I have the physical and emotional and intellectual wounds from that, right? Yeah. Other organisations, LGBT Noise and Marriage Ecology, were keeping up the momentum. Like, there was all of us involved. We might not have had the best relationships at the time. It's a small world. We all know each other. So, you know, sometimes that's not the easiest. But actually...
The Civil War. It was ongoing. That sound you hear is stony silence from Brian while he rolls his eyes at my sensationalist tabloid journalism.
You might say that. I couldn't possibly
comment. I'm allowed
comment.
to say these things. I'm a comedian. I'm obliged to make such dangerous jokes such as that. I'll take the heat. It seemed that civil partnership had become the safest for the establishment. Support grew among political parties in the Dáil thanks to lobbying by organisations like Glen behind the scenes. But a stronger counter-view began to form.
We really were fearful that if we settled for civil partnership, that's all we'd ever have, was some kind of second-class yoke.
There were protests against civil partnership. Outside the Dáil, the night it was being debated, I remember really very difficult and heightened protests outside of that as people from Glen were kind of coming out of Leinster House.
When civil partnership was finally introduced by the Irish government in January 2011, or rolled out, as they say, or came on stream, lots of couples did get one. Over 2,000 couples. And some of me feels like saying, come on, like, no surrender, all or nothing, wait for marriage. But that's so easy to say now. Let's not forget that at that time, no one could predict the referendum of 2015 would happen in the first place, let alone that it would pass. Broadcaster Sean Monsanji gives his take, and he's still reflective on it.
I did get a civil partnership.
Oh, you did?
I did, I know. Yes, we did get a civil partnership, and then I always say, like, we upgraded to marriage then when they let us. But civil partnership was like, I suppose, it take what you can get, I suppose. Maybe looking back, maybe we shouldn't have. Maybe we should have been like, it's all or nothing. But, yeah.
It's funny, looking back, do you feel like, if we settled, do you feel like that?
At the time, I didn't totally think like that because we didn't have marriage equality.
We were used to
I kind of went, we're used to that.
We were used to that. It was like, don't hit me, that'll do sometimes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is. It's like, well, of course, because we weren't equal. Yes, so I took it, but yeah, I suppose, yeah, I hadn't overly analysed that, but when I think about it, I think I will look back and go, yeah, I suppose it is settling, it is taking what they're giving, but what choice do you have?
Only 10 months after the introduction of civil partnership, the Missing Pieces report, launched by Marriage Equality in October 2011, identified over 169 differences between civil partnership and civil marriage across 7 areas: the family home, finance, legal procedures, administration, parent and child, immigration, and equality. That number of differences is undeniable, but there was still plenty of support for civil partnership. In 2011, I was blissfully unaware of any of these divisive discussions. I was 22 and too cool to consider marriage. It would have been quite premature, to be honest, considering I hadn't been on one date. And before I started making this pod and having these conversations, I think I probably ignorantly would have been super right on about marriage and equality being the only answers. No way, man, you know, don't capitulate to the hetero overlords and the state and get a little civil partnership. And I'm kind of humbled now to learn that the achievement of civil partnership was also hard fought. Steely hard work, picking through laws on a minute granular level. The work done by Glenn and others was also carried out with generosity, vision, passion and integrity.
One group of people who kind of don't get a mention when we talk about marriage is those who had civil partnerships. There was 2,071 couples had civil partnerships from 2011 to 2015, and I think they're the unsung heroes of marriage, of the referendum, because all over the country, and we used to collect the front pages of the regional newspapers, where I'm from Clare, right, West Clare. The first lesbian couple in Clare who had their wedding was in Kilbaha, and they had their reception in Keatings in Kilbaha, and there was photographs in the Clare Champion. And they had they're from Clare. If you take it, there was, 50, 100 people there. 50 or 100 people said, oh, I'm going to a gay wedding, it's all a bit weird. Even lesbians, right? And then they went home and went back to work the following day and said, lads, I had a fantastic weekend. There was this brilliant wedding, these gorgeous couple who said the same things I said when I married my husband or wife, you know. And that broke through in ways that was extraordinary and meant that things we never really thought of when a referendum was necessary, that you have to win every constituency, or at least you have to try, rather than waiting for urban constituencies. I think it's those couples who had civil partnerships and were public and open about it and invited their families and their friends. They broke through and broke ceilings everywhere. They were brave and courageous and groundbreaking, and they created the space for most Irish people to move towards marriage, and it only took 5 years.
I'm bringing back in Lisa Connell here, who we heard from in episode 1. She's one of the founders of LGBT Noise and campaigned aggressively and dramatically in favour of marriage equality.
Obviously, the two camps of people that were like, civil partnerships a stepping stone, and then some folk who were saying, well, civil partnerships a load of crap.
People have been referring to it as the LGBT civil war.
Oh, wow.
People being me. I'm the only person who uses that terminology, and no one else is comfortable with it. But there was a touch of that.
Yeah,
so this was at the same time. So at the same time, this was civil partnership was going on, and then civil partnership was coming, or it already arrived. Some people were saying we don't want that. We want marriage equality. There's a whole other set of people who are going, I don't want marriage at all. Who cares?
Yeah.
And then you were chaining yourselves to the doll.
Yeah.
Cool.
And like that's kind of how a brilliantly democratic, free society should operate. Like everybody has their sort of part to play, and they folk that believed strongly. I mean, and also we have to be respectful. There were a lot of couples who had actual needs to be addressed legally, and so civil partnership, of course, undeniably played a role and had a part and was necessary. But I suppose in terms of strategic decisions and resources and people's energies, everybody has a different opinion on where that should have been focused or how the campaign is structured and run. And listen, you know, I love thinking about, there's an expression, victory has many parents and failure is an orphan. And there is a piece to that as well, which is, you know, the interesting thing to look back on 10 years later is we all got it there by various ways and means. But what if it hadn't? You know, what if we hadn't? And what would that have looked like? And how would we have collectively as a community felt?
Is the show too gay? Is it too gay? I just check in on that sometimes, because I sometimes, do you know, like I'd be gigging, like not a show like this, I'd be gigging around the city. I'm a comedian, and I'd be gigging somewhere with a few lads or whatever, and they'll say like, the straight boys always come up and say like good set, man. Like, oh cheers, you too, that's really funny. And they're like, that gay stuff, so funny tonight, man. The gay stuff? I was like, that's literally just my life. Like I don't have anything else to talk about, you know what I mean?
We have to talk about Panti again. If If you browsed the papers at the time in Ireland, you'd be forgiven for thinking it was Panti herself who lobbied the government for gay marriage, drafted the legislation in her dressing room while fixing her wig, then personally giving everyone in Ireland a crossbar to the polling station on the voting day. Now, she may not have done all that, but in 2014 she found herself raising eyebrows, got chins wagging and making everyone in Ireland have a conversation or two. While discussing gay marriage on a chat show on RTE television, some of Panti's comments relating to homophobia soon led to complaints of legal action for defamation against both O'Neill and RTE. RTE subsequently issued an apology and paid a substantial sum to those who had complained about being defamed by the broadcast. The whole controversy was dubbed Pantigate. In the midst of the ongoing media storm, Panti was invited on stage at the Abbey Theatre, Ireland's national theatre, during a run of The Risen People, a play about the 1913 strike and lockout in Dublin, oppression of the working classes. Theatre maker Philip McMahon recalls this moment.
At the end of every show, they asked a different prominent artist person to come and say something. Some people would come on and read a Yeats poem after one show. And then Panti came on, but the audience didn't have the knowledge of, all of these other people have done it. And so Panti came on and people were like, well, there's a drag queen on stage. Should I be laughing?
I'm giving you this little clip, but you do need to go and watch it all on YouTube. It's only 10 minutes.
Have any of you ever come home in the evening and turned on the television and there is a panel of people, nice people, respectable people, smart people, the kind of people who probably make good neighbourly neighbours, the kind of people who write for newspapers, and they're all sitting around and they are having a reasoned debate on the television, a reasoned debate about you. About what kind of person you are, about whether or not you're capable of being a good parent, about whether you want to destroy marriage, about whether or not you're safe around children, about whether or not God herself thinks you're an abomination, about whether in fact maybe you are intrinsically disordered. And even the nice TV presenter lady that you feel is like almost a friend because you see her being nice on TV all the time, even she thinks it's perfectly okay that they're all having this reasoned debate about you and about who you are and about what rights you deserve or don't deserve. And that feels oppressive.
A full video of the speech was on YouTube and Facebook that very same night. Panti goes viral again. It's shared on social media home and abroad. Graham Norton, RuPaul, Madonna. Panti's speech hits headlines and news sites around the world. Irish Times journalist and author Fintan O'Toole calling it the most eloquent Irish speech since Daniel O'Connell, the great liberator.
There's kind of a refrain in it that every crosswalk or cafe, Panti or any of us check ourselves. Do people think that, are people looking at me going, there's a gay? Are they judging me just by breathing the same air as them? And that kind of having to kind of always check yourself in every room. Or we even know now, a plumber comes into your house and you're like, I've got to come out to the plumber. And the refrain in the speech is, that feels oppressive. And I think that what she was trying to do, and did successfully in some way, was to give the ordinary viewer and listener in Ireland kind of a window into what it is to be us.
I watched it at home on my laptop at my parents' house in Dublin, and I felt every word, recognised every feeling, and then I felt exposed, felt vulnerable. Panti had talked about shame and about little moments of checking yourself and kind of hating yourself just for being gay. And I couldn't believe now that everyone who had watched that video now knew that's how I felt. Panti put words on feelings that queer people didn't even notice they had, fears that were too painful to face. Everyday aches so dull and unyielding, I realised that sometime long ago I had unconsciously decided just to live with it. The speech became a news story unto itself. It got people talking in the pubs, in the office and at the dinner table. People who had never really considered the impact of homophobia before were listening. Hardly anyone was thinking about the referendum to come the following year. Their thoughts weren't centred on marriage. But we were thinking about equality.
Gay and lesbian couples and their supporters celebrating their victory in Dublin this afternoon. The 97 convention members in Malahide had voted overwhelmingly for constitutional reform to allow civil same-sex marriage. Sweet music to the ears of the woman who's fighting in the courts for legal recognition of her lesbian relationship as a marriage.
I am overwhelmed. It is a great feeling that I'm just with Anne-Louise and myself. We're just almost there now for a recognition of our human right to marry the person that we chose to love in Ireland.
The government has promised a decision on a referendum following a Doyle debate on the Commission's report in the autumn. Joe Little, RTE News, Malahide, County Dublin.
The Constitutional Convention recommended a referendum be held, but that didn't mean it was just going to happen. There would still need to be campaigners. People were still going to need to lobby the government. Fine Gael didn't even endorse it themselves at the convention. Plenty of activists attended that day, ones we've heard from both sides of the divisive context of civil partnership versus marriage equality. And it seemed that the overwhelming support in favour of a referendum was influential on them too.
The move to becoming yes equality took about a year, and it really was on foot of the Constitutional Convention, where the citizens had been brought together to look at the issue of marriage, and by a huge majority they were telling the government, you need to put this to a referendum and you need to do it quickly. And the numbers were amazing. I mean, it was up 79-80% on most of the issues that they were voting on. And in that weekends looking at it out in Malahide in the Grand Hotel, there were 100 individuals. Some of them were politicians. Most of them were just ordinary people picked off the electoral register. And what really shifted and moved them, I believe, was when we had the children of LGBT people speak about what it felt like for them, for their parents not to be able to get married. And you could see in the room people thinking, geez, imagine if your parents couldn't get married. That's terrible. So just on a fairness basis, the room shifted right up in the 70s and the 80s to telling the government this needs to be done, and if it needs a referendum, then so be it. Let's have that.
So I did feel that while there were years of difficulty between Glen and marriage equality, and I was part of marriage equality, but I had and still have many friends who were in Glen, and I really felt that ultimately what we needed to do was to move together, which is actually what happened in the actual Yes Equality campaign.
Marriage Equality, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties and Glen agreed to come together to campaign for a public referendum on civil marriage equality, an end to the Great Gay Civil War. Listen, I did tell you today was going to be a lot of information, and I hope your head's not spinning. Well, if it is, here's the sus. We've gone from nobody likes the gays to people starting to accept the gays. And this is because brave queers were out and proud enough and set about getting their feet in any door they wanted. There was no provision for gay marriage in the Constitution, but Katherine and Louise were precocious and courageous enough to make people think that maybe there could be such a provision. Around civil partnership, the work of organisations like Glen showed that the state could and might allow some form of recognition of same-sex couples existing, and that they should be allowed to. A citizens' assembly discussing same-sex marriage had their hearts warmed and minds changed by the children of LGBT parents. A man in heels on the national stage reminds everyone across the world how exhausting the ongoing toil of homophobia can be. All of it happens from queer people fighting their own corner. Their lives, their stories, their fears and feelings, their hopes and dreams. If you ever catch a politician telling you how their party were instrumental in getting this referendum over the line, then you refer them to this podcast. It was, as it always was, real people, real stories. And there are more to come. To get the Irish government to agree to a referendum, it went back to Republican ideals, the Irish Proclamation.
We've always had centre-right governments in Ireland, right? So we always assumed that a centre-left government would be better at these things. So we were stuck with the two largest parties, one way or another. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael were going to be the parties. They are not known for their liberal credentials. So the idea that they would go from nothing to marriage was hard to conceive. In the first place, that doesn't mean it wouldn't have happened. And they still Fianna Fáil spent political capital bringing this through, right? So it was about the idea of a republic, the idea of equal treatment, and that's how we pitched it. You know, Fianna Fáil, the Republican Party, equal rights for citizens in the Republic, and that's how we pitched them. And that's, you know, I don't mean bought it, they believe it, we believe it, they believe it.
I believe the gays are looking to get married. 2 fellas getting married. Well, yeah, you better believe it. Come back to us for episode 3. There's a referendum, and we're going to win.
The referendum made me mad. Like, I was angry on levels.
Every morning I would look out the window of my bedroom window. What looked in at me was a no poster. And I was just like, how did we get here?
The idea of going to someone's door as a gay person and being like, please vote on my rights.
I just think putting people's lives up for debate that way, it leaves a bad taste in my mouth.
I basically, of course, naturally enough, had to use the opportunity to encourage everyone to vote straight after Mass.
So did you vote? And he said, I did. And she said, in what way did you vote? And he's like, I voted no. Oh my God, my heart sank. I was like, oh my God.
More on all that in the next episode. You've been listening to Ireland Said Yes, written and hosted by me, Shane Daniel Byrne. Special thanks to all of our contributors who took part in this series. Audio design, mixing and sound editing by Fionn O'Brien and Paul McGregor. Visual design by Stephen King O'Farrell and Conor Daly. News archive courtesy of RTE, Virgin Media, BBC, Channel 4 News, CNN, Euronews and Associated Press. Archive images and video courtesy of Getty Images. Music and sound effects courtesy of Audio Network and Epidemic Sound. Legal counsel Hugh Hannigan and Claire Telford. Executive producer Sasha Hamrogue. Developed and produced by series producer Paul McGregor. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it on your socials, tell your mum and your mates, and consider giving us a 5-star review wherever you're listening. Ireland Said Yes is an Onic original.